Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into his story, a medieval mystery, really. Have you heard about the Green Children of Woolpit?
I certainly have. It's one of those historical accounts that just grabs your attention and makes you wonder.
Right, so we're in 12th century England. Picture a village, Woolpit in Suffolk. And yes, the name comes from those wolf pits they used to have there.
And dedicated to the Virgin Mary, no less. A bit of a strange juxtaposition.
Absolutely. So during harvest time, two kids just show up. And get this, their skin is green, like as green as grass. We're going to try and unpack this whole thing.
And thankfully, we have some pretty good sources for a story like this. Two guys, William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall, both clergymen, by the way. They wrote about it.
They did, which makes it even more fascinating. We're not talking about some random rumor here. So let's get into it. What happened in Woolpit all those years ago?
It was a normal day, seemingly. People out harvesting, sun shining near one of those wolf pits, actually.
Dedicated to Mary, right? I wonder if that played into people's reactions at all.
Could have. Anyway, suddenly, two children appear. Boy and a girl. Their clothes are strange, nobody understands their language, and, well, they're green. Bright green.
I can't even imagine. Must have been quite the shock for those villagers.
Oh, absolutely. Fear, curiosity, probably some suspicion too, but being good Christian folk, they took the kids in, offered them food and shelter.
That's good to hear. So mystery solved. They lived happily ever after.
Not so fast. Things get stranger. The kids refuse to eat anything except raw beans.
Raw beans. That's odd. What do you make of that?
It's a pretty important detail, actually, recorded by both William and Ralph. Makes you think they weren't just playing pretend, doesn't it?
It really does. Like, where did they come from that raw beans were the norm? Okay, so raw beans for a while. Then what?
Well, as they gradually started eating other foods.
Like normal people.
Like normal people, yes. Their green color began to fade. They started to look like any other kid.
Wow. So the greenness was somehow tied to their diet? Or maybe where they'd been living before?
That's one of the big mysteries, isn't it? And speaking of mysteries, once the girl learned English, she was able to tell people where they'd come from.
St. Martin's Land. It's almost legendary at this point. What did she say about it?
She described a land of constant twilight, no real sunrise. They had churches, Christian people, but always dim. Almost otherworldly light, she said.
She also mentioned seeing another land, right? Across a river bathed in sunlight, like a completely different place.
Yes. It's mind-boggling trying to imagine what that means. Maybe traveling between worlds. Who knows?
And how they got to Woolpit is pretty wild, too. She said she and her brother were tending their father's flock, heard the sound of bells, like church bells, and suddenly they were by the pits.
Like a portal or something. This story has it all, doesn't it?
It really is. Okay, so we have this amazing story told by those two chroniclers. What more can you tell us about them and what they wrote?
Well, William of Newburgh, he was an Augustinian canon, and known to be skeptical. But even H.E. found the story believable enough to write about.
That says something. What about Ralph?
Ralph of Coggeshall, a Cistercian monk, wrote his account about 30 years after William. He says he heard it directly from Sir Richard de Calne, the landowner who took care of the children.
Oh, firsthand. That's pretty good sourcing for back then.
Did Ralph add anything new?
He did. He writes that the girl said everything in their homeland was green, not just a people. And he describes them going into a cave, drawn by the sound of bells, and ending up by those pits, like a mystical call.
Wow. So two slightly different accounts, but both agree something very strange happened. But now, for the tough question. As devout Catholics, how do we approach this story? How do we know if these sources are even reliable?
Yeah, that is the question, isn't it? We can appreciate the work these chroniclers did, trying to record events as they understood them. Men of God they were, but they were writing decades later, based on what people told them.
So, embellishments, mistakes.
It's possible. We have to look at it with a critical eye. Were William and Ralph trying to prove something theological with this story?
Like evidence of miracles? Maybe. Or a cautionary tale, who knows? Their perspective as Christians definitely influenced how they saw it all.
And neither of them gives a concrete explanation for where the children came from, do they?
No. They present it as a marvel, something beyond easy explanation. And I think that's what keeps us fascinated even now. It makes us consider all the possibilities.
Exactly. It's like a historical puzzle. So what are some of the theories out there? What might explain this mystery?
Well, some people lean towards folklore and myth. Green beings coming from the earth. It fits with old stories about fairies, otherworldly creatures.
Especially with those wolf pits right there. I can see how people's imaginations would run wild.
Of course. And that description of St. Martin's Land, always twilight, It could definitely be seen as a symbolic otherworld, something beyond our understanding.
Fascinating. But there's also a more grounded theory, right? The Flemish children theory.
Right. This one suggests the children were refugees. From a Flemish community in England, forced migrations were pretty common in the Middle Ages, and that often led to prejudice against those who were different.
So the green skin could be a metaphor, a way of representing how different they were from the villagers.
Exactly. And there was a large Flemish population in England back then. The Battle of Fornham St. Martin, not too far from Woolpit, involved Flemish mercenaries. A lot of violence and displacement.
So these children, speaking Flemish, wearing strange clothes, they would have seemed very other to the English villagers.
Exactly. And not knowing the local food, remember, they only ate raw beans at first that would add to the sense of them being outsiders.
Makes sense. But wouldn't someone have recognized the language as Flemish?
Maybe their dialect was so different the villagers just couldn't understand. Communication back then wasn't easy.
True. But what about that green skin, specifically? Could it have been something like malnutrition?
It's possible. Hypochromic anemia, they used to call it green sickness, can result from malnutrition. It can give the skin a pale greenish look.
And we know the girl's skin went back to normal once she started eating a balanced diet. That fits.
It does. But of course, no theory is perfect. That description of a land of perpetual twilight doesn't really fit with the refugee idea.
It's that one detail that keeps pulling us back to the mysterious, which is why some people see the whole story as an allegory, a way of representing deeper anxieties in 12th century England.
Right. The green children as symbols of outsiders, the other. England was still dealing with the effects of the Norman conquest, huge social and cultural changes. Their greenness could represent that foreignness, being different from the established society.
Their language, their clothes, their very appearance, all reflecting how people felt about outsiders joining their community.
Exactly. And even the boy's death, sad as it is, could be interpreted as the failure to assimilate. While the girl surviving, getting married, that symbolizes successful integration.
So the green children aren't just about green skin. They're about cultural exchange, the challenges and anxieties that come with it.
And it reminds us, even in our faith, we're called to welcome those who are different. We're all God's children, no matter what we look like or where we come from.
Well said. And speaking of appearances, we can't ignore the medical theories. Besides the anemia, what else could explain that green skin?
There's something called keratemia. Basically, if you eat a lot of foods high in keratin, like carrots, sweet potatoes, your skin can get a yellowish, even greenish tinge.
Maybe those raw beans had a similar effect.
It's possible. Though, to be fair, neither of these conditions would make someone bright green like the chronicles describe.
Though that mystery remains.
It does, and it's a good reminder that not everything has a simple scientific explanation. Some mysteries might just stay mysteries. It does make you think, though, doesn't it? Not everything has a neat and tidy explanation. Maybe that's part of the beauty of it all, the unknown.
I agree. But as much as I love a good mystery, I do like trying to solve them too. So where do we go from here? We've got these sources, these theories. How do we sort through it all?
Well, we have to remember who wrote these accounts. William and Ralph, they were clergymen, men of faith. So their worldview, their beliefs, those definitely shaped how they saw this whole event.
So even though they tried to be accurate, we have to account for their biases.
Exactly. Think about it. Why did they choose to include this story in their chronicles? Was it just for entertainment? Or were they trying to make a larger point?
Maybe they saw it as proof of something, like divine intervention or the power of God's grace.
Possibly. Or maybe they saw it as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what can happen when you stray from the righteous path. We can't know for sure.
But it's important to consider those possibilities. It adds another layer to the whole story, doesn't it?
It does. It reminds us that history isn't just about facts and dates. It's about interpretation, about seeing things through the lens of those who lived it.
And speaking of different lenses, what about that Flemish children theory? We kind of touched on it earlier, but there's a lot to unpack there, isn't there?
Absolutely. This theory connects the Green Children to a real historical event, the presence of Flemish refugees in England during the 12th century.
So these kids might not have been literally green. Maybe it was a way of describing their otherness, their foreignness.
Exactly. Remember, there was a lot of prejudice against Flemish immigrants back then. The Battle of Fornham St. Martin, which wasn't far from Woolpit, involved Flemish mercenaries. It was a bloody conflict with lots of people displaced from their homes.
So these children, speaking a different language, wearing unfamiliar clothes, They would have stood out.
Absolutely. And remember that detail about them only eating raw beans at first? That could be because they simply didn't recognize any of the food offered to them.
Like they were used to a completely different diet.
Exactly. It adds weight to the idea that they were from a completely different culture, and it ties back to that idea of them being perceived as green, as in inexperienced, unfamiliar.
It's fascinating how that one word can have so many layers of meaning, isn't it?
It really is, and it speaks to how we understand history. It's not always about taking things literally. Sometimes we have to look for the deeper meaning, the symbolism behind the words.
So are we saying that the Green Children weren't actually green?
Well, let's consider what we know about medieval chronicles. They were often filled with metaphors and allegories.
Stories meant to teach a lesson or convey a deeper truth.
Exactly. So even if those children weren't literally green, their unusual appearance could have been a way of emphasizing their difference, their otherness.
And that ties back to what you were saying earlier about the chronicler's intentions. Maybe they were using this story to comment on the anxieties and challenges of integrating outsiders into English society.
Precisely. Think about the context. England was still grappling with the aftermath of the Norman conquest, a lot of social upheaval, cultural clashes. The Green Children could be seen as a representation of that tension.
Their strange language, their unfamiliar customs, even that detail about the land of perpetual twilight.
Yeah.
It all adds to this sense of them being from a completely different world.
And it makes you wonder, were they meant to be taken literally, or were they a symbol for something else?
It's almost like the story is asking us to decide what we believe.
In a way, yes. It challenges us to engage with history not just as a collection of facts, but as a tapestry woven with symbolism, interpretation, and, dare I say, a little bit of faith.
Speaking of faith, there's another aspect of this whole story that we haven't really touched on, the religious significance. Both William and Ralph were devout Christians. How do you think their faith influenced how they understood the Green Children?
That's a great point. Remember, both children were baptized shortly after they were found. That act in a medieval Christian context was incredibly important. It signified a spiritual cleansing, a welcoming into the church.
Even though no one knew where these kids came from, they were still seen as souls in need of salvation.
Exactly. It speaks to the universal nature of Christian faith. It doesn't matter where you come from, what you look like, or even what language you speak. You're still a child of God.
And the fact that the boy died soon after being baptized, that must have held a lot of significance for people back then.
It would have. In a medieval mindset, it could be seen as a sign that his soul was pure, ready to enter heaven, a kind of tragic yet ultimately hopeful end to his story.
And what about the girl? She lived, integrated into society, even got married. Is there a spiritual interpretation there, too?
Absolutely. Think about it. She started out green, different, an outsider. But as she learned English, adopted local customs, her greenness faded. She became like everyone else.
Almost like a metaphor for conversion, for shedding your old self and embracing a new life in Christ.
Exactly. Her transformation, both physical and social, could be seen as a parallel to the spiritual journey of a convert. It's a beautiful image, really.
It is. So the Green Children story isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a story about faith, about belonging, about the transformative power of God's grace.
It really adds a whole other dimension to the story, doesn't it? This idea of spiritual transformation.
It does. And it makes me wonder, with all the theories we've discussed, the Flemish children, the anxieties of the time, even the medical possibilities,
Yeah.
is there one that resonates with you more than the others?
You know, it's hard to say. Each theory has its strengths and weaknesses. But what I find most compelling is how the Green Children's story continues to capture our imagination centuries later.
I agree. It's like there's something about this story that speaks to something deep within us, a fascination with the unknown, perhaps, or a desire to understand those who are different from us.
Exactly. And for me, that's where the spiritual interpretation comes in. It reminds us that even in the face of the inexplicable, even when we encounter something that challenges our understanding of the world, there's a deeper truth at play.
A truth that transcends the boundaries of time and space. A truth that connects us all as children of God.
Beautifully put. And that's what I hope our listeners take away from this deep dive. The Green Children of Woolpit, they remain a mystery, but perhaps that's the point. They invite us to embrace wonder, to acknowledge that there are things we may never fully understand.
And to remember that faith and reason, history and spirituality, they're not mutually exclusive. They can coexist, even complement each other as we seek to make sense of the world around us.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our exploration of this fascinating tale, let's hold on to that sense of wonder. Let's keep asking questions, seeking answers, and above all, let's keep our hearts open to the mystery and beauty of God's creation.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Green Children of Woolpit. It's been a truly enriching conversation.
The pleasure was all mine. And to our listeners, may this story continue to spark your curiosity and inspire you to seek out the deeper truths hidden within the mysteries of our world.